Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to SciPo 2021. Well done for defeating technology and joining us. It's wonderful to have you here. We have an amazing program for you. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stephen Wren. I am a practicing academic chemist who also writes poetry. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we have in store for you today before introducing our key conversation session with the esteemed poets Jenny Lewis and David Morley. Later on in the programme, Elsa Hammond will be curating the launch of our new SciPo anthology, and there will be readers from the anthology too. And then the results of our birdsong competition will be announced by David Morley, the judge, for the competition, and he'll read his judge's report, and there will be readings too from this. Then later on, we will kind of reflect on the successes of SciPo over the years before wrapping up. So really hope you enjoy yourself. I should say that during the conversation with David and Jenny, we will be using the Q&A box in Zoom, but we will be collating, sweeping up all of the questions, and we will address those by posting some answers on the Torch website later on. So I need to introduce our distinguished poets, Jenny Lewis and David Morley. Jenny is a poet, playwright, songwriter and translator who teaches poetry at Oxford University. Her first book of poetry, When I Became an Amazon, was performed as an opera by the Tchaikovsky Opera and Ballet Company of Russia in 2017. She's published three further collections, including Gilgamesh Retold, with Carcanet Classics. This was a New Statesman Book of the Year, and Carcanet's first ever audiobook. Her award-winning project, Writing Mesopotamia, with the exiled Iraqi poet Adnan al-Sayegh, was aimed at fostering friendships between English and Arabic-speaking communities. This includes Let Me Tell You What I Saw, extracts from al-Sayegh's epic poem, Urek's Anthem, which was published by Seren in October 2020. David Morley was actually trained as an ecologist, and he won the Ted Hughes Award for The Invisible Gift, selected poems. His books from Carcanet include The Magic of What's There, The Gypsy and the Poet, Enchantment, and The Invisible Kings. And David wrote the best-selling The Cambridge Introduction to Creative Writing and teaches at Warwick University. He pioneered podcasting in creative writing through his slow poetry and writing challenges, spoken word projects. His book Phoenix New Writing was an anthology of Coventry poetry and won the Raymond Williams Prize. His latest book, Fury, was a Poetry Book Society choice and shortlisted for the Forward Prize for Best Collection. David is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. So it is my great honour to introduce Jenny and David, and in this discussion around patterning thought. So over to you both. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. That was a wonderful introduction. And welcome, David. It's absolutely marvellous to have you here with us in Oxford, it feels like. I know you're not in Oxford, but we'll pretend you are. To discuss some of your incredible poetry under the title Patterning Thought, which is the title of this SciPo, our very last SciPo. So are you sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. From the Poetry Archive website, David Morley's background in zoology expressly influences his approach to language, as his collection Scientific Papers 2002 states. Each piece of writing is a scientific paper in itself, a series of findings. Given the poet's interest in the play of phonetics and form, these collections include concrete poetry, use of the pantoum, and the poet is also known elsewhere for his slow poetry sculptures. Language and science, he says, become a single discussion of perception. David, there's an awful lot packed into that paragraph. Could you talk a little bit about these topics, phonetics and form, slow poetry sculptures, which sound incredibly interesting, and how language and science become a single discussion about perception?
Hello, everybody. Can I just say, first of all, thank you to Jenny Lewis and Sarah Watkinson and Lucy Newland as well, and all of you at Torch, and to Stephen Wren and Nikki, who's been very, very scrupulous about setting this all up. I have to say, one of my most prized possessions for writing is a bioacoustic sound dish, which enhances the sound of the natural world and can single out particular sounds, particularly by birds, insects. But even if you hold it close to the sound of sap running through the xylem in a tree. I discovered this partly because of a collaboration with somebody I regard as a kind of supreme poet of bioacoustics, whose name is Jeff Sample, and a fantastically named person, Sample, because that's exactly what he does. He samples the sounds of the natural world and has released a number of recordings through Collins and Penguin, which have mammal sounds, bird sounds, sounds of the morning, sounds of the evening. And the phonetics that you've described there really is, it's the sound of speech within a poem. But for me, it's also the sound of living things of which we are part. I've also been very influenced by Robert Frost's sound of sense, and that's really about the meaning or the intention of words or the tone of voice. But because of where I come from with zoology, I've always been very curious about the sound of sensory perception, recreated by the sound of lines and images and word choice, which you could kind of almost subsume under the title of the music of language, the music of language. And I'm also partly Romany, and I think that's important too. And it's not a question of identity for me so much as language. I'm very curious. I've always been very curious about how Romany works as natural speech, and how Romany language often creates sonic recreations of the things it's describing, and one word can introduce several meanings simultaneously. And so this idea of words that spin into other meanings and have a music of their own, where there's a sense given by their sound, has always been attractive. And that sound dish that I mentioned at the beginning is that's almost like a metaphor for how I try to write. Just to go back to the science, and I've always been taken by Leonardo da Vinci's notion that we should look for the art in science and the science in art. I've never found a division between the two. That's why I call it a single conversation. I was very fortunate as a teenager to go to a school where big ideas were not discussed, where we were channeled through our GCSEs at the time without much discussion about the ramifications of knowledge at all. So I was never taught there was a division between science and arts. And therefore I never really came across that until I was a student at university, by which time I'd formed my way of saying by then. So it's a good fortune But also the other thing about the natural world I find too, and my studies within it, is that although I write in many poetic forms and I'm kind of dazzled and delighted by them, I also find natural forms within, I find poetic forms within a natural world, whether that's the V made by migrating geese being a poetic form to which you might write, or the nests being a poetic form, which I have written in, or even the omega of a predated nest is also something that would, again, entice me or make me think metaphorically about shapes. My scientific research, my PhD, was about midges, insects. And it's a family of midges called the chironomids, non-biting midges. And my work was to understand the impact of acid rain upon them in Lakeland Tarns, in the Lake District. And I found the intense observation I had to bring to looking at these tarns and these microscopic insects and to identify them as well was to my mind almost the same concentration that I brought to writing a poem. They collided all the time, and field work and chemical analysis and all that were forms of concentration in which I wrote my first poems. And this division between the two for me was a kind of constantly rainbowing line between the personal and the world I was studying. So that's how that came about. With slow poetry sculptures, this was about finding a way. This is again about poetic form. I wanted to create new poetic forms. And the poetic forms I came up with was, could you write a poem in a form and place it in such a way that it would increase the species diversity of a habitat? Which may seem like a challenge, but you know, I just used my scientific experience to do that. For example, I wrote 80 haiku, which were planted onto boards of which were Dutch elm that had been killed 20 years before, which were then planted in a National Trust woodland. And my poems were carved into them using artist clay, and the artist clay couldn't actually come alive without urea. So the reason that the haiku were placed so low was to attract the attention of children, but also to attract the attention of dogs. And the dogs would pee on my poems and activate them. The urea would interact with this artist clay. So my poems would start attracting microbes, and then they would start attracting lichen and moss. And so over time, because the sterile Dutch elm did not attract this, my poems would be read by millions of species and grow greener and greener and greener over time. And as the lichen attached to the poems, they would be read or edited, let's say, by blue tits or coal tits or whatever, who took the poems as nesting material. And as these were planted around along with other slow poetry sculptures, the idea was that they actually did increase the species attractiveness of these areas and therefore increase the species diversity. I mean, that's just one example of several things that I did, which were, well, you know, scientifically accurate, and even as I tell them, sound slightly crazy.
I know Sarah will be incredibly excited while you've been saying this, because she's very interested in mosses and moulds and things like that.
Yes.
And I must just put in my own experience of having animals or other species edit my poems that I left quite a long poem out in the garden one night. When I picked it up again in the morning, by mistake, it had been nibbled by slugs down into a haiku. So
yes.
There's a lot to be said for letting nature actually edit our poem.
And they had a feast during the editing process, which many poets do not have. Yeah. But also the coincidence of the predation upon your poem, you know, may have seemed at first random, but sometimes a randomized approach to editing can actually yield unexpected.
Much better poem, thanks to the slugs.
Yes, yeah, but yes.
Yeah, that's amazing, and so I knew that this would happen. That when you started talking, ideas would buzz and fizz, and people would, be incredibly excited. And it's a shame we're not at St Hilda's in that lovely room with Lucy and Sarah, who are also supposed to be here, Sarah Byrne, where people can actually interact with you and ask you questions, because that would be lovely. And maybe we can reorganize that at some stage. But that was a wonderful answer and so full of extraordinary insights. So when you won the Ted Hughes Prize for Innovation in Poetry for The Invisible Gift in 2015, George Surtees said that you conjure a marvellous sense of nature as intimacy, something precise yet loaded and of immense importance to us. And the Poetry Archive gives an example of, with these lines from your poem Goldcrests, to show how poetic language can mimic the actions of birds and animals. In this case, it says the fidgeting, or it says alterations. I'm not sure if they meant altercations, but the fidgeting of birds in their environment. Could you read that?
Yes, of course, of course. Again, this is just by close observation of Goldcrest.
Yeah.
And again, this is about mimicking the music of life with language. I'm always fascinated by the phonetic translations that you find within bird books, where ornithologists are trying to imitate in words what a bird is saying. And they often use poetic terminology to describe them. They talk about birds in terms of lines and verses and rhymes. So a goldcrest, if you listen to it closely, they're actually quite approachable birds. The Collins Bird Guide regards what they say to each other as sisu, 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 si. And so I use that phonetic translation of a bird call as a rhythmic line. I use the rhythm to write lines in which two goldcrests are interacting. It's quite a short poem. Goldcrests. She sings light, he sings lightly, from the pine needled nest cup. He shifts lightly, she shifts light among the burrs in the nest cup. How slightly, how very slight, the sky shrinks to their eggshell hue. How slight, how very slightly light wakes from their eggshell hue. He sees lightly, she sees light in the pine needle dark. She sang light, he sang lightly among the cedars in the dark.
Thank you so much. This is an unscheduled question. Do you ever put your poetry to music? Because the rhythms are so lovely and you can hear them.
They have been put to music, actually to choral music. And there was a recent podcast by Melissa Harrison's, a really great podcaster of the natural world, who did put some Romany poems to a kind of sliding music, which actually worked very well. In fact, I thought they worked better as a result of their music, which doesn't always happen with poetry, as we know.
So you can put them on the Torch website. But there is one more question. Before you read to us from your wonderful, lovely, exciting work. After the launch of your collection, Fury, I don't really need to read this because I can just say it. The Harkenet launch of your collection, Fury, I literally, the next day, it's been very miserable weather, and the next day was beautiful sunny day, and I sat in my kitchen hearing your voice saying the poems and just remembering little bits of poems, little musical cadences, if you like. And when I emailed you to tell you that, and you said, and I said, why do you think it stayed in my head? Because I go to lots of poets launches and admire many poets. And you said that when you were young, or in the past, you'd been a stammerer, and that you developed strategies for reading or communicating. And also you've written a wonderful poem called Translations from a Stammerer, which is in your fantastic collection, Fury. So do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, yes, of course. I'm still a stammerer. I regard most events as quite terrifying. I have to do it all the time,
Yes.
but I've developed many tricks. One of which is rhythm and singing and pausing, as you will notice as I speak. The origins of my stammer are most unpleasant. They kind of originate in violence, which I won't talk about here, but I have written about it. But the effect upon the development of my voice was very severe. However, although it kind of was a torture all the way through my teenage years, looking back on those times, I think that one of the spurs behind my becoming a poet was the stammer. And my reasoning is that it had an effect upon the way that my brain grew when it came to speech. Because I either remained very silent and chose my words with care, and because there were words which I was foreseeing 3 sentences down the line, which I knew I could not say, I had to think way ahead of what I was going to say. And when I saw something coming, like a brick in the wall of my voice, I would find a way around it, which was the least line of verbal resistance. And of course, this is happening all the time. You're finding these different words to say, hopefully the same thing as precisely as possible. But I think that my mind developed into a kind of thesaurus of possibility as a result. And in fact, when I was a teenager, when I did speak, my teachers found me quite wordy because of this expanded vocabulary. And that mixture between kind of the terror of speech and kind of death by 1,000 stutters. I mean, you know, to put it bluntly, anybody who's listening to this, watching this, if you have a stammer, you will know the absolute impact upon your whole behavior and how it can affect your mental health. And I teach and work with young people who have stammers in the hope that I can help them with understanding what you might do with that and how to not let it deter you. But silence, when you have to choose silence as one of the possibilities of proceeding, can lead to a constant sense of esprit d'escalier. It can also produce a lot of guilt because you're not saying what you should have said. And also, I found that actually one of the ways around it wasn't just that least line of resistance, it was kind of becoming other people. I became someone else. And I really liked an idea from the philosopher Levinas when he says that I am most like you when I'm most like myself. And so I was always kind of jumping into people and kind of becoming them, like an act of negative capability and speaking from their point of view. And in these poems in this new book, they are, it's called Translations from a Stammerer. And they're kind of quick versions of phrases from other poets into whose kind of histories I've leapt. I'll read if I can find it. Yeah, I'll just read a couple of these. For instance, in the all these poems stammer in their way, and some of these poets were stammerers. So here's after a phrase by Anna Akhmatova. I like owl lamps to be left burning in each room. Bedroom doors ajar after owl dark. The hearth fire hooting like an owl up the chimney. You lift and light the lantern of an owl. Open the owl door, switch on the owl light. The garden flickers with filaments of owl flight. Tear down our moon, owl, with your talons and talons. The repetition in this, I employ a lot of repetition, partly through stammering. And the poem that actually does stammer is it's just after a phrase by the Russian poet Marina Tsvetaeva. I climbed to the crown of an apple tree in the old cider orchard, the one ancient tree remaining of 300. Grasp apple heavy branches in my fists, shuddering fruit into the leaf shaded shirts and shawls of my glad friends. That there is enough in heaven. These are. The thing is that though I stammer in that poem, it's actually where I would stammer. I mean, that's not faking a stammer.
It's very interesting. I don't want to take up your time, but because when people pause, the people listening change their attention slightly, don't they?
Yes.
Perhaps with slight anxiety.
Yes.
But that actually is a very heightening way to receive communication, isn't it?
Yeah, I think when I'm doing this work, because it's a kind of translation from silence, I am translated myself, and I become bearable to my flaws. Now, I know a stammer is not a flaw. It's not a fallibility, but any stammerer here will know that that's exactly how it's felt. And it's an inescapable quality of it. It's kind of a merciless muse. It can help you, and it can kind of murder you at the same time.
David, thank you so much. So we've got about 20-25 minutes now. If you'd like to just launch out into your poetry, and we will sit back and listen.
Well, because I've been invited to SciPo before, and we were thrown all over the place by the pandemic. We had all sorts of events that we kind of came and had to be cancelled and postponed. And one of the things I really wanted to do was to take people for a walk in Whiteham Woods for an entire day, listening to birdsong. With my dishes, which I have several, and then writing to the rhythm of these things, but also just to look at things very exactly and precisely. And this first poem, though it doesn't kind of do birds as such, it does kind of pull down upon something that was very important to me as I was writing this book. I began rereading my notebooks from when I was doing my PhD, and I found that on one side of the notebooks were fairly terse descriptions of findings. And on the other side was a very personal diary. And I talked about the rainbowing line between the personal and the world. I thought this was it. This is actually, suddenly to my mind, was a poetic form between the world and what's intensely private. And one of the tarns to which I'm very attracted is innominate tarn. For its name being no name, innominate tarn is on the summit of Haystacks, a fell in the Lake District. It's the place where Alfred Wainwright had his ashes scattered. And significance in this is about, if you like, the significance that we bring to bear upon findings, upon mathematics. And the poem has quotes here also from Jane Eyre, and also ends with a quote from Wordsworth, which kind of bookend the personal side of the poem. Significance at innominate tarn. In innominate tarn, the significance of mortality can vary anywhere between 90% and 95%. I weighed the significance of my lover's final word to me, rearranging the letters in the hope of a buried code of meaning, of movement, of radiance. The diversity of bloodworms narrows, given even slight changes in the acidity of precipitation. The shame in me saw only the narrowness of my lover's face, thinned by cigarettes to a staring skeleton. The collapse of fish numbers from acid rain correlates with a collapse of insect larval communities. My first mental collapse came on me like fog during a student party. I walked through the rain until the following afternoon. Innominate tarn, a dawn release of an isolated population of microsectra midges precipitated by acid fallout from Sellafield. Innominate tarn, no name as a name. A glittering alphabet of haiku in water's Japanese form. The tarn spoke her name, without name, a midge's mute syllable of blood. A PhD in the pH scale of Lakeland tarns, from acid to limestone, from summit to corrie. As I counted the million diatoms under my microscope, I grew unable to think of living things as having existence other than in a fury of data. Innominate tarn. Imagine a surface area of zones, niches of seasonal insect variations, midge vortices, submarine rocks and stones and trees, flooded cairns, cloud crowns, and mayfly days as long as 20 days are now. When we talked about shapes and patterns, and this is about patterning thought. When I was shaping this book, yes, one of my favourite poetic forms is the pantoum. And the pantoum is a Malayan form in which there's a certain amount of repetition and weaving of the words in strict orders down the page. And I'm also a professor in Australia, and so I spend time there, and I spend a considerable amount of time in the outback. And there was one occasion when I was there with my young sons, and we went off on a fieldwork expedition and found 14 lyrebirds. Now, the lyrebird is the male lyrebird's song is one of the most melodious and complex of all bird songs, and the males are really superlative mimics. They impersonate other birds, but they also impersonate other animals, and also they impersonate human activity. They can impersonate spot welding machines and burglar alarms and motor drives and cars and also loggers as well. And this idea of the stammer, when I said I became a lyrebird of impersonation, a thesaurus, is kind of melded with this idea behind this pantoum of repeating and going through these ideas. And in the end, I wrote, or constructed, would be a better word, I wrote a 98-line pantoum, which is a long affair and required a lot of cutting and literal pasting with glue and scissors. And as I kind of rewrote it through, I changed the repetition a lot. So I wasn't impersonating exactly the same thing like a lyrebird. I would change tense and nouns, and the only thing that would be remaining in repetition would be tone, just tone. Anyway, I then thought that this poem was far too long, and I cut it into 7 poems of 14 lines. They're in here. And they are in there, all 7 sonnets. Wow. So from form to form to form. Yeah. I'm going to read just two of these. They cut between two people actually in the end, and an avowal is taking place, an avowal between two people and the world. First lyrebird. Your vow is the lyrebird's thesaurus of mimicry. Your vow yaffles with the laughter of a kookaburra. Your vow sings the syllables you share with our children. Your vow lullabies a jungle's stories, canopies, and understory. My vow catapults a kingfisher past a kookaburra. My vow scales a frozen waterfall's icicled aviary. My vow strips a eucalyptus for nests of rainbow lorries. My vow ploughs a ridge walk through a peat bog slog and slurry. Your vow paints Jane Austen's miniatures on 2 inches of ivory. Your vow quickens a bare forest with your footsteps in snow. Your vow spills its watershed through the fells, tarns and freshets and startles snowdrops from the floor of heaven. My vow hushes a fair forest and my footsteps in snow. My vow spies a single star from out the wide night's numbers. You'll see, by the way, with these poems, with a close ear, that there's a lyrebirding of some other poets, all of which are women poets, who have had an enormous influence upon the way that I write, as you might have seen from the poets I was translating to. The 6th lyrebird is... I'm very hard upon my own poetry, as all poets should be. But actually, the final line of this poem is one that I really enjoy, possibly because it reminds me of my children. 6th lyrebird. My vow babbles with quicksilver bubbles of an otter. My vow caws in a beech tree's apoplectic rookery. Your vow catches the pin drop of a pine martin pattering over pine needles. Your vow dodges with a dipper weaving whirlpools under river. Your vow scribes a root word, the speech tablet of a beech tree. Your vow prizes a crossbill's Fibonacci tines of a pine cone. My vow is Emily Dickinson's meadow harvested herbarium. My vow torrents through rain-cleaved clints and grikes. My vow is a child's wordlessness. My vow can be their fury. My vow is Emily Dickinson's love note. Everyone else is prose. Your vow shapes keepsakes from a baby's nearly and early words. Your vow moves the Mohs scale from mica to lapis lazuli. Your vow is a pangolin penguiling into dragon scales and slumbers with an Arctic wolf's snowball pawed, trigger clawed cubs. So I just really like the idea of these Arctic wolf cubs. I do love them so. I mean, it's not that I love the line. I just like the image of those. It's just, I mean, I take such pleasure in these things. I quite like, with your permission, to read something slightly not SciPo here. I've got my eye on the clock. This poem is called Romany Wounds Me. I have a relationship with the Romany language and with Romany people, and I know a lot of travellers. Obviously, I know my mother, but Romanys and travellers have a very difficult time. When I first, on the first day I dated my wife, we went, like the nerds we were, to the Bodleian Library in order to take our vow not to burn the books together. And she took it in Welsh, because you can do it in any language, and I asked to do it in Romany, and they certainly did not have it and treated me abysmally. Obviously, I did not burn their books in revenge, but it did cause me to wonder about Romany and to claim it. But it is wounding being Romany. And this poem, Romany Wounds Me, takes off from an idea from George Sepphoris, where he talks about Greece wounding him. Now, the places in this poem, this is not me, such as a protagonist, but the places in this poem to which this person travels are Stow-on-the-Wold, Kenilworth, Dareham, Horsemondon and Appleby, which are all traditional horse fairs for travellers. It's also a poem that's very much informed by Brexit. Romany wounds me. Wherever I travel, Romany wounds me. As I hoved into the horse fair at Stow-on-the-Wold, between Cotswold chintz shops and the roving road, HGVs hunkered after our wagons on the Foss Way, cursing us with air brakes and granting gear shifts. At Kenilworth Fair, with its tailbacks to Longbridge roundabout, Vardo's bottleneck behind ponies from Pershore, rocks rammed and all the villagers between by neighbourhood watchers with the policeman's nod. At Dareham Fair, I crowbarred the stern stones from the wayside and flattened fat molehills under my 4x4 and snored under the stars of headlights flying over the bypass and slung the crack of my kettle above an illegal blaze. At Gresson Hall, Swaffham and Peterborough, the pubs were barred to me. What do the Gentiles want? These polite people who curse us were Romanian, or worse than. A copper pulls us over and barks for passports. Mate, I come from Rotherham, laughs one gypsy, though it's foreign country round these parts. And as we sleep, Europe drifts away across the sea. The cling net of England closes. Our caravans are ships with their engines flooded. Our lives are drowning. Strange people, the English. They say this land is ours, but they don't rove beyond their commutes or school vans. Imagine the coppers rocking up at their caravan sites. Meanwhile, England keeps on travelling, always travelling backwards. In my dream, our flotilla of caravans set sail from Dover's chalk shore, as though the little boats of Dunkirk were our own gypsy Vardos, as though we were machine gunned by our own Spitfires, and those brothers on the beach were our own strafed kin, which we were when we were borderless and one. Between the horse fairs of Horsemondon and Appleby, at all the stopping places where I wake, and in every face I see, wherever I travel, Romany wounds me.
Love the stern stones and the idea of the headlights making stars. Brilliant. It's very, the imagery is so strong.
I think I should probably stop there, yeah, because of the time.
Have you got one more?
Well, I've always, because I'm a teacher. I'm very, you know, I'll do one kind of fairly small one actually, which has Oxford in it. When I was a student of zoology at Bristol University, one of the poets who was very helpful to me was Ted Hughes. But what Ted did was he directed me away from himself towards his son, Nicholas Hughes, because Nicholas Hughes was in the same boat as I was. He was a zoology student who was writing poetry, or trying to, but whose teacher had dissuaded him from doing so at an early age. So I went to Oxford and I met Nicholas, and the first thing we did, as we always did, was we went out for a long walk. And as some of you may know, Nicholas died in 2009, and I ended up writing a series of sonnets in his memory. I was a freshwater biologist. Nicholas was also a freshwater biologist. I worked on insects, and Nicholas worked on fish. So as he put it, he was higher up on the food chain than I was. Now, this poem is set in Port Meadow in Oxford it's actually in 1983. We're both very young men in this poem, having a lot of kind of, you know, fun in a way. So I'll finish with this. And Nicholas speaks in this poem too. Freshwater, Port Meadow, Oxford, 1983. Walking to Woodstock Road from Whiteham Wood, where leaf worlds welled from all the wood's swans. We talked salmon, midges, flood meadows, the energy system cindering softly under us, slow cooking the marshlands. The gate ought to be here. The map said so. That map, back at my flat. Look, there's a spot somewhere this way where sheep shove through. See those fieldfares and redwings? They landed last night. Then a step within a fence nobody bothered with for years, or knew, except the sheep. So Nick stepped up and through. And there on the other side, two horses with thrilled up ears barged him skillfully to a stop. I said that gate was around here, pointing a mile or two. Worth the way, Nick's arms around both horses, to know these two. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Great thanks. I wish we'd been walking in the Whiteham Woods with you, but perhaps we can do that another time. I hope we can. And I'm going to now hand over to Elsa, who's going to launch the marvellous anthology and tell you all about it. So thank you very much.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jenny. And thank you, David, for that. That was wonderful. So yeah, now I'm going to talk briefly about Angled by the Flood, Poems About the Sea, which is our third anthology, and which arrived today, this afternoon, in fact, through my door. So the poets haven't got their hard copies yet. They're being sent out this evening. But this
hello, and it's my job now to begin to thank people, because we are so very, very pleased and proud of what SciPo has become. SciPo, the conference of SciPo, takes place annually and has done since 2016 in St Hilda's. So this is just to give you a flavour of what a convivial and cheerful event this is. The person I'd like to start first of all by thanking is Jenny Lewis. She is the main progenitor and the inventor of SciPo as an idea, and it's she who has guided it to become a much loved and also much respected annual event. So I think we all owe her a huge debt for that. Jenny has made a huge difference to many, many people, especially in Oxford, because of her teaching at the on the Oxford University Department of Oxford University MSc in creative writing. And so she's a beacon for creative poetry writing in Oxford. And I think a lot of us who are her students, her alumni, are people who've been rescued from not being able to write poetry because they made the wrong choice at the age of 14, or they made a different choice at the age of 14. And so a number of people have been brought from different career backgrounds to the point where they've not only started to write poetry, which Jenny judges is okay, but they have also made their way in the poetry community. And this has been a really life-changing event for all of us who are Jenny's pupils. So I'm certainly not alone in finding that, and I think we should all thank Jenny for this. Then I should like to go on and thank St Hilda's College. This is my college where I've worked as tutor in biology for really longer than I care to say. I'd like to thank St Hilda's, particularly first, I think I'll begin with the college members who've made a big difference, and mainly Elsa. Look at Elsa there in this photograph. She's wearing her yellow trousers. Since 2018, Elsa has been a major contributor to the organisation as well as the poetry, and it was Elsa's idea to bring in better outreach and to use the Oxford University Schools Outreach Programme to reach younger poets and bring them in via the competition. Elsa, of course, has also allowed us to leave a permanent record, a permanent archive of our activities in the form of these 3 magnificent anthologies. And she's been a huge support to me as I make my way in this very unfamiliar environment, not just of poetry, but also of arts administration, which I must say has been very different, to a different experience from science administration. I think you'll recognize a number of eminent people in this picture of cheerful types, but I'd particularly like to thank Georgina Paul, the Vice Principal of St Hilda's, who you see second from the right in the second row back, standing next to Frances Leviston. Georgina has been immensely supportive of SciPo, and it's been a great feature of these events that they've been hugely encouraged by the college. At this 2019, this was the biggest meeting we had, and Georgina not only came along and welcomed us, but also surprised us by appearing as a poet and producing her own translations of German poetry and reading them. I want to thank the College Research Committee because they exist to support interdisciplinary interactions in the college, and they have funded us very generously. In fact, they have made it possible for Elsa to publish these 3 anthologies. So many thanks to them. And then finally, at St Hilda's, I'd like to thank all the staff who are responsible for catering, administration, and publicity, communications, who've all contributed massively to SciPo, made it possible to happen. And in fact, the gardeners who, having this beautiful venue, I think has made it possible to have a very convivial and relaxed sort of SciPo. So the third thing that I would like to thank is Torch. In 2018, we were absolutely delighted to be awarded a grant by Torch. And that gave us so much more funding that we were able to extend our activities into a SciPo network and run a number of workshops in different university departments. And that's included Whiteham, and I certainly hope that we'll set up again the Whiteham Walk with David. I think it'd be a great thing to do. And finally, I'd like to thank Nikki, whose superb administration has made these events possible, and she's treated the whole thing with enormous skill and helps it. So Nikki Carter of Torch, thank you. So Thank you, Nikki. And I'd like to hand on now to Jenny.
I think you're handing on to me, actually, Sarah, if that's okay.
Sorry, Elsa.
Just so we make sure that Jenny's the final voice of this section. Thank you so much. That was yeah, it's great to sort of hear that, be reminded of all of that. I just want to speak very briefly again about the anthologies, just to sort of run through briefly the people who've been involved in them, and oh, there they are, all three of them up there. So the first one was in 2019, and as I said, and as Sarah said, huge thanks to St Hilda's College and to Torch, which sort of both the funding made it possible to kind of do all three of these anthologies. The first one, another big person to thank is Nicola Thomas, who led on the typesetting and design of Haunted by Cycles of Return, that first anthology. And also to Jane Draycott, who allowed her adjudicator's report from the competition that led to some of the poems in that anthology to be published sort of in that anthology at the beginning as well. Then the next year, in 2020, we published A Hatchery of Shadows with Adam Horowitz, typesetting and design, Chris Thorogood, who did that beautiful cover image there in the middle, and then again, Jane Draycott and Carrie Etta, who allowed their adjudicators' reports to be included there, and to Lucy Newlin, who had some lovely words to say and are included on the back cover in a blurb. And then again, just to sort of remind you, the third one that came out today, we've got to thank Caroline Lowe for the beautiful cover, Stephen Wren for his forward, Oliver Harrison for his typesetting and design, and also Philip Gross for his lovely words on the back of the book. All three of these anthologies are going to be able to be bought either separately or as a trilogy. And you can get in touch with me, elsa.hammond@gmail.com, or look on Amazon in a week or so's time. And finally, I just want to thank Sarah and Jenny for sort of supporting me in getting these put together and published. I think that's all. So I'll pass on to Jenny. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone who's taken part today, to start with, especially David, who's brought sort of great gush of nature and ideas and energies to us, to this event, but also to the wonderful readings of the anthology and the two young prize winners whose poems are astonishing. And thank you very much for coming to read them. I'd like to thank Sarah. I'd like to thank her first for thanking me so eloquently and effusively, and I thank her also because without her we could never have had this coming together of poetry and science. I taught Sarah a long time ago, I can't remember what the year was. I think it was on a weekly class, which through the continuing education I started teaching, about 25 years ago, but it wasn't that long ago that Sarah came. And she wrote a wonderful sonnet called Dung Beetles Navigate by Starlight. And I think one of the great joys and rewards of being a teacher is to sort of shuffle through some papers on a dismal evening when you're marking, and to suddenly the whole room lights up with, with this illumination of creativity. And that's what happened when I read Dung Beetles Navigate by Starlight, which of course then became the title poem of Sarah's first published pamphlet. And also another poem she wrote, which I loved very much, and it was called Seeing Hares. I'd like to ask her to read it, but I don't think we've got time, but that's another wonderful poem that I remember. I remember the way she describes a herd of deer looking like a buckskin conveyor belt as they pour down the mountainside in a Scottish mountain. Sarah's way of illuminating science and making it, sort of bringing a vision to it that we can all sort of enter into. It's not about putting scientific words in poems. It's about understanding, and as David earlier today showed, it's about opening up concepts so we can all enter into them and sort of get joy from them. So thank you very much, Sarah, and also just for being at St Hilda's and introducing me to St Hilda's, which is such a wonderful, sort of welcoming and open college. I always say it, instead of most Oxford colleges have sort of ceiling to floor portraits of very important and stern looking men on the walls, and St Hilda's has lots of portraits of women who've also done, you know, exciting and wonderful things with their lives. So I think that that's important for me. I'd just like to say thank you, Sarah. I can't really thank you enough, but you know that the thanks I feel to you. And so I'll just thank our guest poets who we've had the great pleasure before David to host at SciPo. In 2016, we had Samia Guglani, Tony Curtis and Leslie Saunders, who read today very beautifully her prize-winning poem. And Sam Guglani is an oncologist at Cheltenham Hospital. In SciPo 2017, we had Valerie Laws and Mario Petrucci. In SciPo 2018, we had Carrie Etta and Philip Gross. SciPo 2019, which Sarah and Elsa and Nikki pretty well organised on their own, because I think I either was in hospital or I was otherwise engaged. But the guest poets there were Michael Simmons Roberts, Francis Leviston and Adam Horowitz. Our SciPo 2020 was a digital event with Joe Bell, which was curated and presented by Stephen Wren, and we thank him deeply for keeping SciPo alive during 2020 when so many other things were falling by the wayside. And of course, SciPo 2021, we've had the wonderful David Morley. We were to have had also with David, Lucy Newlyn and Sarah Byrne, but perhaps that can be something for the future to get those three together. And the competition judges, 2018, Jane Draycott, 2019, Jane Draycott and Carrie Etta, 2020, Lucy Newlyn, and 2021, David Morley. And I'd just like to finish by thanking my alumni of the Poets' House, Oxford, many of whom I've known since I began teaching in Oxford, so sort of 20 odd years, because they're a wonderful, supportive group of people. The great thing about them is they spend a huge amount of time and energy and effort in working on their craft. They go to readings, they go to do courses, they learn from other people, other poets who are ahead of them on the slopes, if you like. And they also support other poets. They buy other poets' books. They recommend other poets' books. They send other poets emails after they've been to a reading and say, that was great, I particularly liked. And so it's a very much alive community of people who I'm very proud and grateful to have. I've taught many of them, and I'm very grateful to be part of it. So I think that brings me to the end of my thanks as well. So I'm going to hand, oh, yes, sorry, I forgot. I just made a very short collage of some of the highlights of SciPo, the past few years of SciPo. And I think Nikki's going to play that now. And when that finishes, Stephen is going to very kindly draw it all to a close and say goodbye on behalf of us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those wonderful memories there, Jenny. And I'd like to really draw the meeting to a close by again thanking all of the contributors this evening and throughout SciPo's history. Thank you to David again, and to Jenny, to Elsa, to Sarah, to Nikki for all that hard work behind the scenes, and everyone at Torch. And thank you to all the readers tonight, and everyone who's taken part. My special thanks go to Sarah, Elsa and Jenny for really, I think, inspiring the whole community to show the value of science and poetry together. I think both need each other to explain what we see and to bring what we see to life. And I hope that you've been inspired too. SciPo has a lasting legacy, and you can see all of Elsa's wonderful collections and all of the conversations that have taken place and will take place in the future. But we will bring this sense of working together at the interface of science and poetry into a new dawn as well. I hope to start a new initiative at some point, and it's still being worked up. So it's a case of just watch this space, really. So yeah, I hope you've really enjoyed the evening, and stay safe, keep writing, and thank you very much for coming along. Thank you. Bye-bye now.